My fiancé's wealthy family called me a gold digger and demanded I sign a humiliating prenup designed to leave me with nothing. They thought their old money could bully me into submission. They had no idea that my secret startup was worth 10 times their dwindling fortune, and that I was about to turn their high society wedding into the most public, most satisfying lesson on what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman. Before I tell you how I exposed them all at the altar, let me know in the comments, what's the most insulting thing someone has ever said to you? I want to hear the stories of disrespect that fuel our strength. And if you believe in the power of a woman taking back her narrative, please consider subscribing. It helps more stories like this find the audience they were meant for. Now, let me tell you what happened. My love story with Alexander Vance felt, for a long time, like something out of a classic film. He was impossibly handsome, with the easy charm and quiet intelligence that seemed to radiate from him effortlessly. He was an art curator, passionate and knowledgeable, and he saw the world through a lens of beauty and history that I found captivating. Chloe Carter, was a data analyst, a woman who saw the world in patterns and numbers. On the surface, we were opposites, but together, we made a perfect kind of sense. He softened my sharp edges, and I gave his dreamy world a grounding force. Our first year together was a blur of art galleries, late-night talks, and the simple, profound joy of building a life with someone who truly saw you. I was deeply, unequivocally in love. The problem wasn't Alex. The problem was the name he carried. Vance. The Vance family was old money, a term that, I would come to learn, was less about their current bank balance and more about the suffocating weight of their own history. Their fortune, built by a great-grandfather 2 generations ago, had been slowly but steadily dwindling, leaving them with a grand name, a sprawling but mortgaged estate, and a desperate, clawing obsession with social status. The gatekeeper of this crumbling dynasty was Alex's mother, Margaret Vance. My first meeting with her was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as polite society. It was at their cavernous, drafty mansion, a place filled with priceless antiques and the faint, unmistakable scent of decay. Margaret, a woman who looked as if she had been carved from a block of ice, greeted me with a smile that did not touch her cold, assessing eyes. Throughout the entire dinner, she wielded her questions like scalpels. "Chloe, dear," she began, her voice a delicate, silvery weapon, "Alex tells us you run some sort of computer business? How quaint. Is that a profitable little venture for you?" Every word was carefully chosen to diminish me. I had never hidden my work from Alex. I'd told him about the late nights, the stress of securing funding, the thrill of landing major clients. But I realized he had translated my life's work through his own filter, presenting it to his family in a way that made it palatable and, above all, non-threatening. My company, a data analytics startup I had bled and sweat for, which was already clearing 7 figures in revenue, was reduced to a little venture. Her husband, Richard, was a quieter, but equally complicit, figure. He'd chuckle at her thinly veiled insults, adding his own passive-aggressive jabs. When I mentioned I grew up in a middle-class suburban neighborhood, he remarked, "How wonderful for you to experience all of this, then. It must be quite the change." They weren't interested in getting to know me. They were cataloging my deficiencies, measuring me against the impossible standard of their own fading prestige. Alex, my wonderful, loving Alex, was utterly useless in these situations. He was a man caught in the powerful gravitational pull of his mother. He would shoot me apologetic glances across the dinner table, his handsome face etched with discomfort, but he would never ever contradict her. Later, he would wrap me in his arms and apologize profusely. "That's just how she is, Chloe," he'd whisper. "She's from a different generation. Just ignore her. It's you I love." And because I loved him, because I believed our love was the real, solid thing in a world of pretense, I tried. I really did. I smiled through the insults, answered the invasive questions with grace, and endured their condescension, all for the man I loved. The breaking point, the moment the poison finally seeped past my defenses, came about 6 months into our relationship. The Vances were hosting their annual garden party, a ghastly affair where dozens of people with identical frozen smiles stood on a perfectly manicured lawn, drinking lukewarm champagne and judging one another. I had just finished explaining the basics of data encryption to a bewildered elderly woman when Margaret cornered me by the wilting rose bushes. She was with two of her equally terrifying friends, women who looked like couture vultures. "Chloe," Margaret said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around us, "I must admit, I was so surprised when Alex brought you home. He's always been so discerning. But I suppose these days, with our family's reputation, one has to be wary of opportunistic young women." Her friends tittered behind their hands. It was no longer subtle. It was a direct accusation. "What are you implying, Margaret?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. She took a delicate sip of her champagne, her eyes glittering with malice. "Oh, darling, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. A girl with your background, with your ambition, latching onto a name like Vance? It's a tale as old as time. You're a gold digger, my dear. A very pretty one, I'll grant you that, but a gold digger nonetheless." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The polite chatter of the party faded into a dull roar in my ears. I looked for Alex, and I saw him. He was standing not 10 feet away, talking to his father. He had heard her. I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, the way he squared his shoulders and deliberately turned his back, pretending he was engrossed in his conversation. He did nothing. He said nothing. He left me there, alone, to be devoured by the vultures. In that moment, something in me cracked. I finally understood that Alex's love, as real as it might feel in private, was conditional. It existed only in the spaces where his mother's influence could not reach. And those spaces, I was beginning to realize, were shrinking every single day. I excused myself from Margaret's company, my head held high, and walked away. The love was still there, but for the first time, it was joined by a cold, terrifying premonition of the battle that lay ahead. Despite the poison, despite the premonition, I held on. I loved Alex, and a part of me, the stubborn, optimistic part, believed that our commitment to each other could build a fortress strong enough to withstand his family's attacks. When he proposed a few months later, on a windswept cliff overlooking the ocean at sunset, the setting was so perfect, his words so sincere, that I allowed myself to believe it too. I said yes. The ring, a beautiful but modest vintage sapphire, was something he'd picked out himself. A symbol, I thought, of a love that was ours and ours alone. The blissful bubble of our engagement lasted exactly 1 week. It was burst by a phone call from Alex, his voice strained and anxious. "Chloe, we need to talk," he said. "Can I come over?" He arrived at my apartment looking like a man being led to his own execution. He paced my living room, running his hands through his hair, unable to meet my eyes. He was the picture of a man trapped, and I knew, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that the trap had been set by his mother. "My parents," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "They know we're getting married, and they have a condition." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading for an understanding I was not sure I could give. "They won't bless the marriage unless you sign a prenuptial agreement." My heart, which had been fluttering with happiness just days before, felt like it had turned to stone in my chest. A prenup. It wasn't the idea of the document itself that was so offensive. In my world of business and assets, prenups were a practical reality. It was the clear, unadulterated meaning behind it. It was a formal, legally binding declaration of their distrust. It was Margaret's gold digger accusation, now notarized and written in legalese. "They want to protect the family assets," Alex continued, his words spilling out in a desperate rush. "There's a trust fund from my great-grandfather. I can't access the principal until I'm married, and they are the trustees. They said they'll only release it if we have this agreement in place. It's just a formality, Chloe. A piece of paper. It doesn't change how I feel about you." He emailed me the document the next day. It was not just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. I read it in my home office, the words blurring through a haze of rage and heartbreak. It was the most aggressive, one-sided, and insulting legal document I had ever seen. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, I would walk away with absolutely nothing. Not a single penny of spousal support, regardless of how long we were married. I would waive all rights to any increase in value of his assets during our marriage. I would even waive my right to any claim on the home we lived in if it was purchased with Vance family money. The document was meticulously crafted not to protect assets, but to punish and humiliate me. It was a trap, designed to be so offensive that I would refuse, thus proving their point that I was only after their money and giving Alex a reason to end the engagement. I didn't sleep for 2 nights. I paced my condo, the document sitting on my kitchen counter like a venomous snake. I thought about the man I loved, the man who had stood by and done nothing as his mother called me a gold digger, the man who was now asking me to sign a document that enshrined that insult into law. His love was real, I believed that. But his weakness, his inability to stand against his family, was just as real. And in that moment, I understood that his weakness was more dangerous than their malice. Their hatred was predictable. His spinelessness was a wild card that would always leave me vulnerable. My love for him didn't vanish overnight, but something crucial did: my respect. The foundation of our relationship, the belief that we were a team against the world, crumbled into dust. I saw the future laid out before me, a lifetime of fighting his family on my own, a lifetime of him apologizing in private for the humiliations he allowed in public. I knew I couldn't live that life. On the 3rd day, I called him. My voice was calm, my decision made. "I'll sign it, Alex," I said. The wave of pure, unadulterated relief in his voice was sickening. "Oh, thank God, Chloe," he breathed. "Thank you. You see, it's just a piece of paper. It means nothing." Oh, but it did mean something. It meant everything. He thought my agreement was a sign of my submission, a surrender to his family's power. He had no idea it was the exact opposite. It was my declaration of war. The wedding was no longer a celebration of our future. It was now the venue for my revenge. The moment I agreed to sign that insulting piece of paper was the moment our marriage was truly over. He just didn't know it yet. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a strange, surreal performance. To Alex and the Vance family, I was the compliant, defeated fiancé. I smiled at the caterers, I approved the flower arrangements, I endured fittings for a ridiculously expensive wedding gown that Margaret had insisted upon. When I gently offered to help with the astronomical wedding costs, Margaret had looked at me with cold pity. "Thank you, dear," she'd said, "but a Vance wedding is handled by the Vances. We have our standards." The irony that they were likely leveraging the last of their credit to maintain those standards was a secret I savored. On the surface, I was playing my part perfectly. But beneath the surface, a different plan was in motion, a plan forged in the cold, clear fire of my newfound resolve. Alex saw my compliance as a sign that the storm had passed. He was loving and attentive again, relieved that he had successfully navigated the treacherous waters between his mother and me. He had no idea that he hadn't navigated anything. He had simply chosen a side, and in doing so, had handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy them. My first move was a phone call to a man named Julian Croft. Julian wasn't just a lawyer. He was the sharpest, most feared corporate litigator in the city, a man known for his brutal efficiency and his complete lack of sentimentality. I had used his firm for my company's intellectual property contracts. He was not the kind of lawyer you hired for a simple prenup. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to win, unequivocally and devastatingly. I met him in his stark, minimalist office high above the city. I laid out the story, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. I told him about the Vances, about their dwindling fortune and their obsession with status. I told him about Alex's weakness. And then I showed him their prenup. Julian read it, a small, predatory smile playing on his lips. "Well, Miss Carter," he said, setting the papers down. "This isn't a prenuptial agreement. This is a declaration of unconditional surrender. It's designed to be rejected. They're trying to corner you." "I know," I said. "And I've already agreed to sign it." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Have you now?" "That's not a move I would have advised. My goal is no longer to marry Alex Vance," I explained, my voice as cold and hard as the glass table between us. "My goal is to dismantle his family's arrogant assumption that I am a footnote in their story. I want to expose them, and I want to do it on the biggest stage they can imagine, their own son's wedding." The predatory smile returned, wider this time. "I see," he said, leaning forward. "This is not a legal consultation. This is a strategy session. I like it. So, what do you need from me?" "I have no interest in the Vance family's money," I told him. "I want to protect my own. I want you to draft my prenup. An ironclad, bulletproof document that lists my assets in excruciating detail. I want a document that proves, beyond any shadow of a doubt, who the real power is in this relationship." For the next 2 weeks, Julian and his team worked with my accountants. It was a fortune I had built with relentless focus, my success a topic I'd always downplayed. Why? Because I wanted to be seen for my mind, not my money. That was the great irony. Now, my wealth was about to become my sword and my shield. Just 3 months prior, my company, Innovate Analytics, had received an unsolicited and very quiet acquisition offer from a major tech conglomerate. The valuation was staggering, just shy of $50 million. The deal was still in a confidential phase, known only to my board and legal team. To the outside world, I was the successful founder of a promising tech firm. In reality, I was on the cusp of becoming extraordinarily wealthy. Julian drafted a masterpiece. It was a prenup that mirrored theirs in its cold, legal language but dwarfed it in its substance. It meticulously listed my current assets, the stock portfolios, the commercial properties, the beach house. But the crown jewel was the detailed valuation and pending offer for Innovate Analytics. It was a document that didn't just protect me, it redefined the entire narrative. The final piece of the puzzle was the logistics. "They will try to make you sign their document on the wedding day," Julian predicted. "It's a classic power play, a final act of humiliation before the ceremony. You need to be ready." We planned it down to the last detail. My maid of honor, my oldest and most trusted friend, Sarah, was brought into the loop. She would be the keeper of the documents. My prenup, bound in an identical blue folder to theirs, would be hidden in her oversized clutch. The stage was set. The script was written. The actors, save for myself, were all blissfully unaware of the true nature of the play they were in. Alex continued to plan our honeymoon, Margaret continued to boast about the grandeur of the upcoming Vance wedding, and I continued to smile, a serene, placid bride-to-be. But inside, I was a general on the eve of battle, calm, focused, and waiting for the perfect moment to spring my trap. The day of the wedding arrived under a brilliant, cloudless sky. The venue was a historic, sprawling estate with rolling lawns and gardens bursting with white roses, a place that screamed old money, a perfect stage for the Vance family's grand performance. My bridal suite was a flurry of activity. Hairstylists, makeup artists, my bridesmaids fluttering around in silk robes. I sat in the center of it all, a calm island in a sea of managed chaos. I was not a nervous bride. I was a CEO about to close the most important deal of my life. My maid of honor, Sarah, gave me a knowing look as she handed me a glass of champagne. "Are you ready for this?" she whispered, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and concern. I met her gaze in the mirror. "They have no idea what's coming," I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. The plan was for the ceremony to begin at 4 p.m. At 3:45, a knock came at the door. It wasn't my father. It was Alex, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his face a mask of strained anxiety. Behind him stood his parents, Margaret and Richard, both dressed to the nines, their expressions grim and purposeful. This was it. The moment Julian had predicted. "Darling," Alex began, his voice tight. "Can we have a word? It's important." My bridesmaids exchanged worried glances, but I just nodded calmly. "Of course. Everyone, could you give us a moment, please?" Sarah gave my hand a final squeeze, her eyes saying, "Go get them," before shepherding the others out of the room, closing the door behind her. The three of them stepped into the suite. Margaret's eyes swept the room, taking in the expensive dress, the general air of bridal luxury, her expression one of faint disdain, as if I had no right to any of it. Richard stood slightly behind her, a silent, imposing shadow. "Chloe," Margaret began, her voice dripping with condescension, "before this event proceeds, there is one final piece of business we must attend to." She nodded to Richard, who opened a leather briefcase and produced a familiar-looking blue folder. He placed it on the vanity table in front of me with a soft thud. It was their prenup. "We just want to make sure everything is in order," Richard said, his voice a low rumble. "A mere formality, of course. As you know," Margaret continued, "Alex's trust fund is contingent upon this agreement being finalized. We thought it best to handle it now, to avoid any unpleasantness later." This was their masterstroke. Their final, calculated act of humiliation. They had waited until the last possible moment, with the guests arriving and the music about to begin, to corner me. They were backing me into a corner, assuming I would be too flustered, too emotional, too caught up in the fantasy of my wedding day to do anything but sign. They wanted to remind me, one last time, of my place. They were wrong. I looked at Alex. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at a spot on the antique rug, his jaw clenched. "Alex," I said, my voice soft. "Is this what you want?" He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "It's just a formality, Chloe," he whispered, parroting his father's words. "Please, just sign it. Let's not make a scene. Let's just get married." And there it was, his final betrayal. In the moment of truth, when he had the chance to stand up for me, to tell his parents that this was unacceptable, he chose them. He chose their money, their approval, their toxic control. He chose his gilded cage over our love. In that instant, the last lingering embers of my affection for him were extinguished, leaving nothing but cold, hard ash. I picked up the pen they had so thoughtfully provided. It felt heavy in my hand, like a weapon. I looked at the three of them, at their expectant, triumphant faces. They thought they were witnessing my surrender. They had no idea they were witnessing their own execution. With a steady hand, I uncapped the pen, leaned over the vanity, and signed my name on the dotted line of their insulting, worthless document. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Margaret's tense face relaxed into a smug, victorious smile. Richard nodded, satisfied. Alex looked like a man who had just been pardoned. They thought they had won. "Excellent," I said, my voice suddenly clear and cold as ice, cutting through their self-congratulatory haze. I turned to Sarah, who had slipped back into the room as planned. "Sarah, may I have the other folder, please?" Sarah handed me the second blue folder from her clutch. It was identical to theirs. I placed it on the vanity table next to their signed prenup. The Vances stared at it, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. "Now it's your turn," I said, sliding the folder towards Alex. "This is my prenup. It just ensures you can't touch my assets. Sign it, Alex." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The air, which moments before had been thick with their smug satisfaction, was now charged with a stunned, electric silence. The three of them stared at the second blue folder as if it were a bomb. Alex, who had been on the verge of pulling me into a relieved embrace, froze mid-motion. Margaret's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion that quickly hardened into suspicion. Richard's stoic facade cracked, his eyes narrowing. "What is this, Chloe?" Margaret demanded, her voice losing its silvery edge and taking on a sharper, more strident tone. "What kind of game are you playing?" "It's no game, Margaret," I replied, my voice calm and measured. I was no longer the flustered bride. I was the CEO in the boardroom. "It's just a formality. A piece of paper. You understand, of course. One has to protect one's assets." I was throwing their own condescending words back at them, and they landed with the force of a slap. Alex finally found his voice, a weak, stammering sound. Your assets. Chloe, what are you talking about? My family is just—" "I'm not talking about your family's assets, Alex," I interrupted, my gaze locking onto his. "I'm talking about mine." I pushed the folder closer to him. "Open it. Read it. Then you can sign it." He hesitated, looking to his mother for guidance, a lifelong habit he couldn't break even now. Margaret gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of her head. But it was too late. The trap was sprung. His curiosity, and a dawning sense of dread, got the better of him. With a trembling hand, he reached out and opened the folder. I had instructed Julian to put the most important part on the very first page, the summary of net worth. It was a simple, elegant table, listing my holdings in cold, hard, undeniable numbers. As Alex's eyes scanned the page, I watched the series of emotions play out across his face like a tragic film. First, confusion as he saw the name of my company, Innovate Analytics. Then, disbelief as his eyes moved to the line item detailing the pending acquisition offer, a number with 7 zeros. Then came the stocks, the properties, the investment portfolios, each line item another nail in the coffin of his reality. His face, which had been pale before, turned a ghastly ashen white. His mouth fell open. He looked up from the document, his eyes wide with a horror that was almost comical. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. The woman he thought was a simple middle-class girl, the gold digger his mother had so confidently identified, was, in fact, an order of magnitude wealthier than his entire family combined. Their old money, dwindling and tied up in illiquid assets, was a quaint little puddle next to the ocean of my self-made fortune. He passed the document to his mother, his hand shaking. Margaret snatched it from him. She read the first page, her icy composure shattering like a dropped icicle. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of aristocratic disdain, crumpled into a grotesque mixture of shock and fury. I could see her mind racing, recalculating, trying to process this impossible new information. She had built her entire narrative around my supposed inferiority, my desperate need for her family's name. And in one single page, that narrative had been utterly demolished. Richard peered over her shoulder, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He looked like he was having trouble breathing. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint, cheerful sound of the wedding march starting up in the garden outside. The irony was exquisite. "Sign it, Alex," I said again, my voice soft but insistent. "It's just like yours. It says that in the event of a divorce, you will have no claim to any of my assets." I looked him dead in the eye, letting the full weight of the situation settle upon him. "It seems only fair, don't you think?" He was speechless. He looked from the document to his parents, then back to me. He was a man adrift, his entire worldview capsized. He had built his life on the foundation of his family's superiority, and that foundation had just been revealed to be sand. His parents, the powerful figures who had orchestrated this whole humiliating affair, were now just two stunned, foolish-looking old people, their grand legacy exposed as a sham. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment he could have, perhaps, redeemed himself. He could have laughed. He could have thrown the paper down and said, "To hell with them, Chloe. It's you I love." He could have finally, for the first time in his life, chosen me. He didn't. He just stared at me, his expression one of utter, helpless defeat. The wedding music swelled, a cheerful, insistent reminder of the life we were supposed to be starting. But we both knew it was over. The reversal was complete. The power had shifted, irrevocably and absolutely. I had them exactly where I wanted them. The final scene of our tragic comedy played out in the suffocating silence of the bridal suite, with the joyful strains of the string quartet serving as a deeply ironic soundtrack. The three Van Cess stood there, frozen, united in their shared, stunned humiliation. Margaret was the first to recover, her shock quickly morphing into a desperate, sputtering rage. "This is a trick," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "A vulgar little trick. You think this changes anything? You think some new money gives you class?" "It's not about class, Margaret," I said, my voice cutting through her tirade with a calm, surgical precision. "It was never about class. It was about character. And you have all just shown me yours." I turned my attention back to Alex. He was still staring at me, his eyes filled with a new, horrifying kind of calculation. I could see it dawning on him, the true scale of what he had just lost. It wasn't just me. It was the lifestyle, the power, the security that my fortune represented. His face, which had been a mask of shock, now twisted into something that looked horribly like regret. But it wasn't regret for hurting me. It was regret for making a bad investment. "Chloe," he started, his voice cracking. I didn't know. If I had known." And that was the final, most damning admission. If I had known. He was telling me, in no uncertain terms, that his love, his commitment, his respect, were all contingent upon my net worth. The insult was so profound, so complete, it was almost cleansing. It burned away the last vestiges of any lingering doubt, any foolish, sentimental attachment I might have had. It left me with a feeling of absolute, liberating clarity. "You didn't know," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "No, you didn't. You saw what you wanted to see. You saw a girl from a simple background, and you assumed she was simple. Your mother called me a gold digger, a woman who was after your family's scraps. And you, Alex, you believed her. You stood by and let her say it. You brought me this insulting piece of paper and asked me to sign away my dignity just to appease her. You thought I was digging for gold." I paused, letting my words sink in, savoring the look of dawning horror on his face. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a confidential, devastating whisper. "But you see, Alex, you had it all wrong. I was never the digger." I looked from him to his stunned parents and back again. I was the gold. I let that statement settle in the silent room. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I reached up and took off the beautiful vintage sapphire engagement ring, the one he had placed on my finger on that windswept cliff. It felt surprisingly light in my hand. I looked at it for a moment, a symbol of a love that had been real, but had ultimately been poisoned by weakness and greed. It no longer belonged to me. I walked over to the vanity table where the two blue folders lay side by side. I placed the ring neatly on top of my prenup, the one he would never sign. It sat there, glittering under the lights, a final, beautiful punctuation mark on our finished story. "The wedding is off," I said, my voice ringing with a finality that was absolute. I looked at the three of them one last time, three shipwrecked figures, marooned on the island of their own arrogance. "Thank you for being so honest with me. You've given me the greatest gift I could have ever asked for, the truth." And with that, I turned my back on them. I walked away from my fiancé, from his family, from the ridiculously expensive wedding dress hanging on the door. I walked out of the suite, past my stunned but secretly thrilled bridesmaids, and didn't look back. As I walked down the grand, echoing hallway of the estate, leaving them to explain to their 200 high society guests why there would be no bride, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of freedom. The gold digger had just walked away with all the gold. And I had never felt richer in my entire life.